Assalamualaikum, my name is Arfat and welcome to a brand new video. Today's video will be about the book of Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. I will be discussing about the history of the book of Corinthians, the content or the narrative of the book of Corinthians, the community behind the book of Corinthians, the alleged author of the book of Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and how the book of Corinthians was actually composed and how it was put together, inshallah ta'ala. So this video I foresee will be a long video, but just bear with me here, inshallah ta'ala. May all of us benefit from this video. So the book of Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians falls under the undisputed Pauline epistles. Now, the undisputed Pauline epistles basically means that scholars agree that the 1st and 2nd Corinthians is amongst the 7th authentic Pauline epistles. Now, I use the word authentic here very loosely because even though it is undisputed, but contents within these 7 epistles, these 7 books written by Paul, have been disputed, like Philippians chapter 2, for example, and also we will go through today 2nd Corinthians. There's different compositional materials which we will go through inshallah ta'ala. Now, Paul allegedly wrote the book of Corinthians. Now, I use the word allegedly because even though scholars believe that Paul actually wrote the book of Corinthians, but Paul could have used scribes even to dictate Silvanus, Timothy, and also because we do not have the extant manuscripts, the original manuscripts from the 1st century, 2nd century of the complete book of Corinthians, and so we cannot for certain say that Paul actually write the book of Corinthians. But when the book of Corinthians are ascribed to Paul, it basically means that Paul had something to do with it. No matter, even though we do not know how much Paul actually had something to do with it. Now, just to give you an overall outline picture, the 7 authentic Pauline epistles, 1st Thessalonians, the very first letter to be written, the very first book in the New Testament to have been written, followed by Philemon, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. What else do we have here? Galatians and Romans. Romans believed to be the last epistles to have been written somewhere around the year 60 or 62, probably by the end of 62, because according to Christian tradition, Paul was martyred in the year 62. Some people say 64, but probably we are not certain whether Peter was crucified upside down according to Eusebius in the year 64, or they got mixed up within the two, but nevertheless it doesn't really matter that much. So Paul and Peter were crucified or were killed or were martyred, depending on how you look at it, by the mid-60s. This is according to Christian tradition. We do not have any evidence to this. It must be said here. We do not have any evidence, even though artifacts have been attributed to, for example, this is the chain that the ankle bone of Jesus. Again, if you go to certain parts of the world, they allegedly believe that this is the ankle bone of Jesus. But again, there is no evidence, and there's no scientific evidence as well to prove that this is actually the bone of Jesus. But anyway, we will not go that far. We will try to not go too much on a tangent today because this video is already going to be a long one, longer than usual, I believe, unless something magical happens. But anyway, returning back to our narrative, Corinthians was probably written in somewhere around the early 50s to the late 50s, probably around the date of 52 to 58 or 60 even, but that's a bit too far. So First Thessalonian was the first book to be written, and so the First Corinthians allegedly could have been the next book to have been written, but there is also called the Alpha Corinthians according to E.P. Sanders, and that could have been the earliest Corinthian correspondence that Paul actually wrote, or one of the earliest. Unfortunately, that document has not survived. We do not have that document in our midst currently, so we can only assume that because Paul alluded to that letter that he had written, and so scholars presume that he first wrote to the Corinthians before the First and Second Corinthians, the Alpha Corinthians being the primitive letter that no longer survive. Now, does this primitive letter actually was this written earlier than First Thessalonians? This is a very, very good question. I do not believe so, because of the chronology. One more thing I should say, that readers or viewers should watch my videos on the life of Paul, whereby I narrate the travel history of Paul, where did he go next, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, I do not have the time to narrate the life of Paul, and also it will be redundant for me to do so because I've made videos of that. So if you want to know more about the life of Paul, check out my video on the life of Paul. Inshallah ta'ala, it will benefit you as well. And so probably chronology does not support the idea that Alpha Corinthians was written before First Thessalonians, probably slightly after, because Paul spent just a very short time in Thessalonica, and then he moved to Corinth. But anyway, we'll skip this life of Paul anyway. So the Second Corinthians is a continuation of First Corinthians in the New Testament, but this is highly disputed because Second Corinthians, by the way, First Corinthians, scholars believe that this was written in one shot, even though there's several literary themes and some scholars have actually done analysis, but I take the opinion whereby First Corinthians is like a solid flow, 98% of the time, whereas this is not so the case for Second Corinthians. Second Corinthians, Raymond Brown lists up to at least 5 different compositional period, at least around 5. Some scholars have put it to 3, like Professor Bart Ehrman, and some scholars believe there's 4, but mostly around 3 to 5 compositional material, 2 to 5, I must say, 2 to 5 compositional material. First being chapter 1 to 9, and then 10 to 13. Some believe, actually majority of scholars believe, Raymond Brown, Dale Martin, Bart Ehrman, Giza Vermesh, they believe that chapter 10 to 13 was actually written earlier than chapter 1 to 9, and they call this the reconcilable epistle, reconcilable narrative or portion of Second Corinthians, whereas chapter 10 to 13 is the angry Paul, whereby Paul wrote harshly from chapter 10 to 13, and then for some reason chapter 1 to 9, which came earlier ironically, is a much happier Paul, and there seems to be the community that Paul was addressing in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 to 9 seems to he and this community, whoever they may be, have reconciled their differences, their disagreement, and those who caused problems have been rebuked and have been dealt with harshly. And so Paul congratulates the community for having taken action against these transgressors. And so Paul wrote a consolatory letter, a much happier letter, that is Corinthians chapter 1 to 9. There's also much further divisions. Corinthians chapter 1 to 7, and then 8 and 9 is a different uh, parts that have been compiled together that make Second Corinthians. And there's also some scholars who say that chapter 1 to 4 is also a division, and then chapter 5 to 7, and then chapter 8 and 9. So there's further divisions. It's about 5 divisions all along. But I am of the opinion that probably chapter 1 to 7 is was composed from a different letter, and then 8 and 9 was composed from a different letter, and then 10 to 13 definitely, based on the material, the narrative evidence, is probably from a different letter as well. So at least about 3 letters was compiled by a later redactor. Redactor basically means editor. And then probably around the turn of the 1st century or so, all of these Pauline epistles was compiled, including what we have today, 2nd Corinthians. And so if you put it in a nutshell, 2nd Corinthians was probably made up of 3 different letters that have been seamed together, that have been combined together by a later redactor. Now this is the opinion of majority of the critical scholars. They unanimously agree on this, but some have gone to extreme and actually does further analysis and present some further data, which I will not narrate because those scholarly opinions have not gotten to the mainstream scholarship yet. So we don't know if they'll get into the mainstream opinion. But if you know what I'm talking about, then you know what I'm talking about. There's no need to narrate because it's not confirmed. And those are just minority opinion. But so we have 1st Corinthians, and then we have 2nd Corinthians, which was made up of several different letters. So the narrative of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. The reason Paul wrote to Corinthians, but before I will mention this, I should actually compare the church, okay, quote unquote church, house churches. By the way, when Paul, churches during Paul's day, okay, were not. It's not like modern day church, whereby you have this huge building and all these ceremonies and things like that. So Paul, the church that Paul founded were house churches, okay, probably held at the rich person's house, okay, the richest person of the community, because they normally live in a much larger house, so they can accommodate much more people in it, and also they can provide drinks and refreshments to the congregations, and so on and so forth. Now, according to studies done, there are many house churches in Corinth, in Thessalonica, in Asia Minor and things like that. And so we're probably looking at a case whereby within a certain district, if you can even call it a district, within a certain district, there are probably one church, house churches, and then right next across a little bit further up the hill or something like that, there'll be another house churches, and this actually ties down with the Johannine community as well, because there seems to be some dispute within the different church groups in the Johannine community, which is also another interesting history, which I will narrate inshallah ta'ala in my future videos. And so the churches that Paul founded were house churches. In Thessalonica, the churches were brand new. And so Paul had to teach the Thessalonians exactly what they need to do and things like that. But when we come to the church in Corinth, the church in Corinth seems to be more established. Paul doesn't need to go into details and explain the things that he had to do actually for the Thessalonians. And so the Thessalonians church is very different from the Corinthian church. The Corinthian church is a church whereby Paul actually, I believe Paul did not found. He did not found this church. The church was simply already there because Paul got into a dispute with them, a disagreement with them, okay, with regards to the practices. The Corinthian church, if you do a very thorough analysis, they seem at first, obviously they all ended up, when Second Corinthians was written, the reconciliatory letter was written, chapter 1 to 9, or chapter 1 to 7 if you want to take a more critical approach. But we'll just leave chapter 1 to 9 here for the present discussion. Chapter 1 to 9 seems to be a conclusion of the Corinthian correspondence that we currently have. Because it seems to me when I read it that the Corinthians finally gave in, and then they decided to follow the preaching or the teachings of Paul. Because at the end of the day, Paul and them reconcile, meaning they match up the differences and so on and so forth. Now there is another letter called the Third Corinthians, but that is not authentic. But then again, if you read Third Corinthians, that problems arise again. And if you want to take history into consideration, I was actually thinking about narrating Third Corinthians as well, but I want to limit my discussion today to First and Second Corinthians. We can dedicate Third Corinthians because because chapter 1 to 9 of Second Corinthians seems to me that the problems that Paul had with the Corinthian church, okay, with the people in Corinth, seems to be made up, okay, meaning they reconciled the differences. But if you read Third Corinthians, the problem arises again, and so they never really reconcile. And so this is something interesting that we should keep in mind, because that actually affects the history of early Christianity. And so the discussion that we are having here right now is just a very small piece, and it's a very small piece of a much bigger picture that escalates between Jewish Christianity and Pauline Christianity. There's a fantastic book written, Pauline Christianity, but it is part of the Oxford Bible series. Yeah, I have it here. I hope this is the book. Yeah, Pauline Christianity, Robert John Zeisler. Okay, written in 1990 something, 94 I believe, 92, 94. Yeah, but pretty much the study is still followed today. And so it is very interesting from the very small community that opposes Paul at first in Corinth, that opposes Paul, it eventually grew into a much bigger scale and split between Jewish Christianity and Pauline Christianity. Now, my personal when I read the Corinthian correspondence, First and Second Corinthians, that is, Third Corinthians as well, but we'll leave Third Corinthians aside. First and Second Corinthians, it seems to me that the message of Jesus have already been spread by Jews, okay, by Jews, whilst Jesus was still preaching in Galilee. Okay, now why do I believe this is so? Because it takes because if you look at the Corinthian church is a much more established church. And so it takes some time for church to be established, for people to be grounded in theology. Corinthian was probably written 54. If we use that dating, let's just put it at 55, okay, or probably early 50s. Let's just put it at 52, depending on when First Thessalonians was probably written. According to some scholars, it was written in 48. It was written in even 40, 52. So datings are pretty much very vast here, and so we'll stick to 50, early 50s. Let's just use a date 50. Yeah, 50 to 52, 50. So First Thessalonians was probably written in 48, and then First Corinthians was probably written in 50. And so Jesus ascended probably around the year 30 to 33, depending on which Gospels you read. But we'll leave it to 30 for now. And so 20 years is actually sufficient time for the church to develop their theology, to be grounded in their theology, so on and so forth. But the reason for me, I believe that probably whilst Jesus was preaching in Galilee, Jewish Christians, okay, the followers of Jesus, have probably spread the message to Achaia, okay, to Corinth. And that would actually give plenty of time for them to actually learn their theology and the message of Jesus. And that is why when Paul probably came in 48, 50s, even depending on when he was there. The problem that we have here is that doesn't mean Paul goes to a certain place and then when he left that place he needs to write a letter back. No. Most of the time when we know this because he only wrote to these communities because they have deviated from his preaching. So Paul could have been to Corinth much earlier, and then when message got to him that the people in Corinth were have gone astray from his teachings, and then he wrote them a letter back. Now letters take some time to travel, depending on where Paul was. We can't really trust the book of Acts in this narrative, and I'll avoid using the narrative of the book of Acts when it comes to chronology. And also sometimes whatever Paul wrote, we must take it. We must not take it literally, because that is how ancient people write. When they write something, they don't always mean it literally, and so. But at the end of the day, we cannot always assume that whenever Paul left a certain place, he immediately wrote them back a letter. And I think some scholars have asserted this to be the case, and I don't think that this is the opinion that I like to adopt. And so message do take some time to get to people, depending on where Paul was presently. But it is also hypothetically plausible that the Jewish Christians have traveled to Corinth while Jesus was preaching in Galilee, or probably after the ascension of Jesus. To me, it doesn't really matter. The idea here is that we need to buy time, because we need to put into consideration that it takes some time for a church to be established, especially the community that we have in Corinth, which is actually a much stronger community. The Corinthian and the Galatian community, they're actually one of the stronger community when it comes to understanding the message of Jesus. So Paul had a very hard time dealing with them. Especially Galatians. He uses harsh terminologies like, "Oh, foolish Galatians, what have belied you," and things like that. And so the Corinthian correspondence and the Galatian correspondence prove that the churches that was there uh, do not always agree at first, at least at first, with what Paul preached, or they agree and then they believe that this Paul is just nonsense. This is not what was taught to us by Jewish Christians, and so on and so forth. And so we want to go back to our old ways. And so when Paul found out about this, he had to write harsh letters to these people because he's preached to them, and then they decided to return back to their old ways. Now here I am using a lot of presumptions, and you should take note of this because we do not have a lot of evidence. We can only go by educated guesses, which scholars have put up in commentaries, and also by inferring from the narrative in the New Testament. And arguments, like I said, arguments could go both ways. Okay, it could be that Paul actually believed that his message of Jesus was actually the true message, because Paul must have been taught by someone, because he wasn't a companion of Jesus. And so Jewish Christians must have preached to Paul as well, probably in Asia Minor. Again, I do not want to use Tarsus because that is only mentioned by Luke. Paul himself never mentioned that he's from Tarsus. Tarsus used to be a center of of learning, just like Oxford and Cambridge, Yale, and like that. When it comes to rhetoric and philosophy, and so by Luke, okay, whoever he may be, by Luke narrating that Paul was actually born in Tarsus. He's just trying to enhance his protagonist in his narrative, in his book, and so we cannot really trust that. But anyway, Paul, wherever he may have been born or grew up in, he is one of the more educated people in the ancient first century, the Common Era, in Asia Minor, Galilee, Palestine, Achaia, modern day Greece, things like that. So he is definitely one of the more educated, but he must have been taught by Jewish Christians because the message of Jesus was pretty much preached to the Palestinians, and they were Jews. Okay, they were Jews, and so one of the Jews must have taught Paul or his community. Okay, they must have evangelized. Again, the Gospels mention to go out to the lands and preach the gospel. Okay, the book of Luke mentions this as well. Okay, the sending out of the 12 apostles, and so somewhere along the line, these people, even though the Gospels narrate that they only go around Galilee to do that, wherever you find Jewish community, and do not go out into the land of the Gentiles. Okay, and so probably in one of these cities that the disciples of Jesus preach in, one of the communities in there, the people within that community, they probably go and preach somewhere else, and then probably to the Jewish community in the diaspora, because we know ever since the temple was destroyed, okay, and the Babylonian exile, Jews have been, and also the attacks of Assyria, Jews living in ancient Palestine have actually moved elsewhere. They moved to Yemen, they moved to Turkey, modern day Turkey, Asia Minor. We have a strong Jewish community in Rome before they were expelled by the 2nd century, and also we have in Alexandria a strong Jewish community in Iraq as well, in Iraq, Iran, and also in Spain and Portugal and Morocco as well. So there's Jewish communities almost everywhere because they have been expelled from their Holy Land, and so probably one of these Jewish Christians that the disciples of Jesus have preached in their towns or their community. They eventually preached to the Jews in diaspora, and Paul was probably amongst the Jews in diaspora that was probably preached by one of these community that the disciples of Jesus had preached in much earlier. And so it takes some time for a message to travel and things like that. And so Paul did not receive the message of Jesus firsthand, and a lot of critical scholars agree with this, even though some scholars have written books, especially the purple books, if you know about Paul. Not mention the book, the name of the book, but it's a purple book, if you know what I'm talking about. I completely disagree with this narrative, also because a lot of scholars disagree, and we cannot rely on the book of Acts, because the book of Acts is unreliable, because at certain stage it goes completely against what Paul himself actually preached. And so we have to rely on what Paul actually says, and we cannot use the book of Acts. But do I deny the book of Acts completely as not historical? No, I do not do that as well. But we do have to use the materials in the book of Acts carefully. If not, we will have the narrative wrong. So anyway, returning back to the history behind the Corinthians community, and so probably also one of these Jewish Christians that the disciples of Jesus had preached in, okay, they came to Corinth and preached the message of Jesus as well, because there are Jews in Corinth as well. Even though majority of scholars believe that there are Gentiles only, majority Gentiles in Corinth, and that Paul preached to the Gentiles, but then again, how certain are they? They cannot be. We have no certainty in this. This is just presumptions. I do not doubt that probably the Jewish Christians preach to the Gentiles as well. But if you read the Gospels, Jesus says, "Do not go into the land of the Gentiles," and so it makes more sense that it could do not go into the land of the Gentiles or do not preach to the Gentiles. It does not necessarily mean that you cannot preach to diaspora Jews. And so probably there are Jews living in the community in Corinth, and then they have been preached by one of the disciples of Jesus, okay, or the community that these disciples of Jesus preach in. And then the Jews in Corinth could have probably preached to Gentiles, and the same for the Galatian communities as well. Even though we have to put into consideration here that there are mention of super apostles, okay, in the Pauline corpus, and Paul wasn't the only one going around communities and preaching the message of Jesus, okay, because there are people, Jewish Christians, that came to Corinth as well and then preached the message of Jesus. And so we have to look at the chronology here really carefully and try to analyze it much deeper. Who was there first? Was the Jewish Christians there first, or was Paul there first? It makes more sense to believe that Paul was there first. Okay? Paul was there first, and then when he preached to the Corinthians, accepted his message, and then this apostle came and then preached a different message than Paul, And then the Corinthians accepted this message, and then Paul got to know about this, and so he wrote them a letter. Okay, it could also be that one of the people in Corinth within the community that Paul preached in learned from Jewish Christians, okay, that whatever Paul had taught them or taught his community earlier is actually not the true preachings of Jesus. And so this person, whoever he may be, he or she, probably goes back to his community in Corinth, or he was there all along, okay, and then decided to preach the original message that Jesus actually preached. And then Paul also got to know about this, and then he became angry, so on and so forth. Because of the presence of the assertions, a very strong assertions by Epistandis of the Alpha Corinthians, this theory is much more plausible. It has been elevated that Paul was actually probably there first, and then something happened, and then he wrote them a harsh letter, even. But argument could go both ways as well. It could be that early Jewish Christians were there, but then their message were restricted to only Jews in Corinth. And then when Paul came, Paul opened it up to Gentile. And so Paul preached a different message than what the Jewish Christians themselves have understood to be. And so we have Gentiles on one side, and then we have Jewish Christians in Corinth on the other side. And so the Jewish Christians were trying to convey to Gentile Christians that whatever Paul had preached to them is actually not the true preachings that they had learned from the disciples of Jesus himself, or the disciples of the disciples of Jesus. You get what I mean? Okay. The chain of narration when it comes to knowledge goes back to Jesus from the Jewish Christian community, whereas the message that Paul preached have been distorted, even though Paul was earlier on preached and received the message by the disciples of Jesus. Okay, and so both Paul and the Jewish Christian community, they both received the message from Jesus directly, okay, through a chain of narration. But somewhere along the line, this Jewish Christian community in Corinth, they realized that, hold on a second, the message have been twisted here. This is not what we were taught by the disciples of Jesus. Okay? And isn't it ironic that Paul himself was a Jew, a Pharisaic Jew, and he got his message or knowledge from the disciples of Jesus. Okay, but then the message have been changed, so something is wrong there. And so that is when the Jewish Christian community in Corinth actually step up and causes commotion. Okay, this is also one of a plausible theory out of hundreds. Okay, people have proposed. And so anyway, we can spend the next 5 hours hypothesizing different theories and things like that. But the bottom line here is that somewhere along the line, the Corinthians had a commotion with Paul because they believed that Paul was probably telling them the wrong thing. And so Paul had to write them a harsh letter. And then at the end of the day, things were reconciled because we have 2 Corinthians chapter 1 to 9 or 1 to 7. But then again, if we include 3 Corinthians, it wasn't actually reconciled. Okay, the problem was still there and persists being there. Okay, so that's pretty much an overall narrative or the history behind the Corinthian letter. Okay, the history behind it when it comes to the socio-political history. Now, the content of the Corinthian correspondence themselves. I've narrated a lot from Second Corinthians, and so I'll focus the next 10 minutes or so on First Corinthians. The problem, there are many problems actually, but I do not have the time to go through them all. One of the major problems was that people were sleeping with their stepmom. Yeah, people were sleeping with their stepmother, um, and there is all these are actually evidence, okay, that Paul were actually writing to a Gentile community, okay, because Jewish Christians who have been versed with the Torah know that this is completely prohibited. Okay, this is completely prohibited. Leviticus prohibits sleeping with one's stepmom, even. Okay, Leviticus 15 even prohibits one from being close to their family. If you know Leviticus 15, once they became impure due to self-indulgence, and then they are impure until evening, okay, until probably around 7 p.m. our time in the modern world. Okay, once they touch a dead meat, they became impure, and so these rulings. This does not mean that this doesn't happen, okay, but it is highly more plausible in the Roman world, in the Roman pagan world, in the world of the Gentiles. Now, when I use the word pagan, and when scholars uses the word pagan, it is not a form of derogatory term. Okay, it is not to mock any particular religion. It is just that it is an English word. Okay, that has meanings which we very much need in our context. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And so people sleeping with their stepmom, and then people, the richer people were eating early on, okay, and leaving no food for the much poorer people who had to work the whole day, and then they only came in the evening to eat the meal, the Eucharist meal. And so Paul addresses all these issues and problem as well. Now, the or I would say the main problem, or one of the main problem, was that people were there's divisions in the community in Corinth. Okay, and this pretty much ties down with Second Corinthians, and that is one of the reasons why scholars believe that both First and Second Corinthians is actually a body of works, and that is why it is also one of the criteria that actually make these two uniquely Pauline, and also because of the vocabulary, the verbs, the tenses that was used, like writing styles, the choice of words and things like that. They fall pretty much into this body of work called the authentic Pauline epistles. Okay, remember we use the word authentic here very loosely. And so the book of Corinthians is actually one of my favorite book. The Corinthian correspondence, First and Second Corinthians, is actually one of my favorite books in the New Testament because of the rich history that you can find. I would say the most richest when it comes to inferring, okay, social political history in the early Christian world. It is much more so than Romans, Galatians, and all the other undisputed or disputed Pauline epistles. Because the Corinthian correspondence, if we include Third Corinthians, seems to be a flow, not when it comes to canonicity, okay, not because of the canon, but because of the historical narrative. But there are problems with Third Corinthians as well, We know that it's probably written much later. It could not have been written by Paul, because chronological reasoning does not support that 3rd Corinthians falls under the same body of works, because of the history behind it. And I will explain, inshallah, when we get to 3rd Corinthians. It's probably written in the 80s. According to Eusebius, it was mentioned by Clement of Rome, if I'm not mistaken. And so Clement of Rome, probably around the 90s, turn of the 1st century or so. And so definitely Paul will have died. If we use Christian tradition as the game changer here, Paul was martyred around 62, 64. And so he could not have written 3rd Corinthians because he's already dead. Alright, so we'll move to manuscripts, manuscripts traditions. I'll just be brief here. This video is already long enough. So, complete manuscripts of the New Testament that we have, okay, irregardless of any piece of document that we have in the New Testament today, okay, came from Sinaiticus, Codex Sinaiticus, about 300 years after 2nd and 1st Corinthians were written. Okay, about 300 years after they were written. And we do not have any complete extant manuscripts. Okay, extant manuscripts basically extant basically means the manuscripts that we have presently. Okay, so we do not have any extant manuscripts before that of the complete new books in the New Testament. Okay, we do not have that period. We have many copies of the book of Corinthians, which came from the 9th and 8th centuries, but we have fragmentary copies here and there. The Pauline epistles, we know for a fact that they were popular and they have been chosen or been read by Christian communities all throughout the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, was because that there are many fragmentary copies of the Pauline epistles from the 2nd century onwards. And so this is why scholars know that from the 2nd century onwards, people have actually embraced the Pauline epistles. But that does not mean that they embraces these Pauline epistles as scripture, right? We should make a fine distinction here. Doesn't mean that a book was well read or read by majority of people. That doesn't mean that they deem it to be scripture, okay, or authoritative scripture. A lot of fundamentalists and evangelists falls mistaken in this way, because they thought that there's a lot of people reading the book of Paul, and so it is definitely part of scripture. No. We have a lot of people reading some gospels that we cannot find in the New Testament. People are reading books all the time in the ancient world. There's a lot of copies of the book of philosophy. Okay? We know that the church fathers have a lot of books on philosophy. They were philosophers themselves, infused with theology. But that doesn't mean that this book of philosophy were actually scripture. That is just bizarre to think that way. In fact, we have Sinaiticus, which contains Shepherd of Hermas, and then how come that is not in anywhere in the New Testament today? We know that for a fact that popular books made it to Sinaiticus, and people reading Sinaiticus deemed this to be authentic scripture. In fact, there are even theory whereby Sinaiticus is actually one of the 50 codices authorized by what's the name of this? Uh, the Emperor Constantine. Okay, this is just a mere theory, though. But the manuscripts tradition of Sinaiticus pretty much support this idea. Even though we have to make mention here that some scholars disagree on this. But anyway, just because a lot of Pauline epistles were read by majority of the people around the Mediterranean, even that doesn't mean that the Pauline epistles are deemed to be authentic scripture. In fact, people were reading tons of books all the time. There is a great book by Oxford University Press, and I've reviewed this book called The Biblical Canon List. It is an expensive book, though, I must say. It is a very expensive book, but it lists down the books, okay, that people read all around the ancient Mediterranean, mentioned by church fathers, the canon here and there. And you just need to analyze them, read that book. And you'll know that just because a lot of books were well read by different people all the time, that doesn't mean that they viewed them as scripture, right? So this is a bizarre thinking by some fundamentalists and evangelists. So at the end of the day, we do not have extant manuscripts within the first 3 centuries of the Corinthian correspondence. And so there are strong support that 2 Corinthians were actually not unanimous. A unanimous letter was probably fused by several different letters that made up 2 Corinthians. And it is also plausible that a later redactor or compiler of these Pauline epistles by the turn of the 1st century or so, the turn of the 2nd century, I must say, from 100 CE to 101 CE, probably compiled all these Pauline epistles and disseminated them, because Paul wrote different epistles to different community, different country even today. And so a later compiler must have compiled all these manuscripts, okay, copied them, and then, probably a student of Paul also, student of Silvanus, Timothy, Titus, whoever it could be, which have direct link to Paul, or not direct link to Paul as well. They compile these letters, and then it gets disseminated, or it gets distributed, so on and so forth. And that is how the Pauline letters came to be. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'll end my video here. Thank you for sticking out. Hopefully this have been beneficial for you, inshallah ta'ala. As I narrate this, I start to recall the book of Corinthians as well, so it benefits me as well. And I like making this sort of discussion, but the only problem that I have is that this sort of discussion needs to be done at length. They cannot be done as in brief, because there's just too many details that we can explore into, and this is great exercise for our brain as well. But anyway, do let me know what you think. There are many theories as to the compositional materials of the Corinthian correspondence. I've just narrated you theories proposed by scholars like Raymond Brown, scholars like Dale Martin, Bart Ehrman, but there are many scholars, Joseph Fitzmyer, there are many scholars. And I also recommend and encourage you to read the theories proposed by fundamental scholars, fundamentalists, evangelical scholars, and also by scholars that doesn't fall into these 2 categories, if you know what I mean. I have their books, I read their books. It is a great way to exercise your brain. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Arfat. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.